Schmaltzy. I'd like to call the meeting to order. Pursuant to the order of reference from the House of Commons of February 13th, the Legislative Committee on Bill C20 will now resume its study of the bill. I would like to inform the committee that it shall reserve the last 20 minutes at the end of the meeting in camera in order to discuss internal matters such as what has been done by the subcommittee on agenda and procedure regarding the list of witnesses, the upcoming calendar, and the adoption of the budget. Moreover, as everyone knows, the bells will start ringing at 5:15 sharp for votes. Therefore, we'll have between 80 and 90 minutes with our witnesses today. I know all of you are eager after the Easter break, after consulting with your constituents about this bill. So I know you're eager to pose our Privy Council officials many questions. And please allow me at first to introduce them. We have with us today Dan McDougall, Director of Operations, Isa Gros-Louis, Director, and Grégoire Weber. Welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We are pleased to be here today to discuss Bill C20, the Senate Appointment Consultations Act. We would like to review with the committee the policy framework for the bill, as well as to discuss the structure of the bill and any details of this legislative proposal. In the first instance, in order to set the context, I think it may be useful to start off with a brief description of what the bill does not do.
It does not provide for a process for electing senators. Rather, much like the Referendum Act, it sets out a scheme for consultations with Canadians without binding the Prime Minister or the Governor-General to the results of a consultation. As well as was discussed briefly with the committee when the Minister appeared before you, neither does Bill C20 amend the Constitution of Canada. Indeed, the bill has been carefully drafted so as to not affect the Governor-General's power to appoint senators, the Prime Minister's prerogative to recommend persons for appointment to the Senate, the constitutional qualifications of senators, or indeed the role of the Senate, as arbiter of the eligibility of senators. However, what the bill does do is provide a bank of names of persons from which the Prime Minister may choose to make a recommendation for appointment to the Senate as vacancies arise. Persons appointed from this list will have the democratic support of voters. The bill provides that a consultation normally will be held in conjunction with a federal general election. The Governor and Council can make an order for consultation, and the consultation process, which relies extensively on the Canada Elections Act, will be administered by the Chief Electoral Officer. The bill provides that a consultation could also be held in conjunction with a provincial general election, provided that 6 months' notice is so given. Bill C20 provides flexibility as to whether and when to use a consultation, in how many provinces to hold a consultation during a federal or provincial election, and for how many places. The number of places is not determined by the number of vacancies in the Senate. Even if there are no existing vacancies in a province, a consultation may be held for the number of places specified in the order for a consultation. This flexibility may help to ensure that nominees are available to fill seats as they become vacant.
Canadians may register their nominations at any time with the Chief Electoral Officer. They do not need to wait for an order for consultation to be issued. A nominee must be 30 years of age or older and must be a Canadian citizen. Of course, prior to being called to take up a place in the Senate, a nominee would need to comply with the other eligibility criteria that are set out in the Constitution. Once registered, nominees may begin to accept contributions for their campaign. The rules governing contributions are based on the rules applicable to candidates for the position of Member of Parliament as outlined in the Canada Elections Act, with some exceptions. For instance, candidates for election to the House must wait until an election is called before they can issue receipts for contributions.
As compared to the House, political parties will have a limited role in relation to Senate nominees. The bill provides that parties may endorse a nominee, but may not endorse more nominees in a province than there are places specified in the order for consultation. Parties will not be able to transfer funds to Senate nominees. There will be no Senate-only parties. That to conduct advertising, parties will have to register as a third party, and that parties will not control the order of nominees on the ballot, nor will candidates be grouped on the ballot by party. Consultations will be province-wide, allowing voters to indicate their preferences amongst all nominees in that province. The voter will be able to rank his or her preferred candidates as 1, 2, 3, and so on, expressing as many or as few preferences as desired, across or within party lines, employing whatever criteria is favored by the voter. The design principle of the bill is to provide as much flexibility as possible to the voter. Complementing that principle, the proposed voting system, called the Single Transferable Vote, or STV, is also designed to reflect as closely as possible the intentions of the voters. The bill provides that after counting the votes, a list of selected nominees for each province in which a consultation is held will be submitted by the Chief Electoral Officer to the Prime Minister for his consideration. The bill also provides that the Chief Electoral Officer must also publish this report, along with other details of the vote, in the Canada Gazette without delay.
In the interest of time, perhaps I could highlight some of the other key provisions of the bill. There are extensive sections of the bill dealing with advertising and communications, with third-party advertising, with financial administration, and, of course, a section dealing with enforcement. As a general statement, these provisions are complementary to comparable provisions in the Canada Elections Act, taking care always to have the least impact possible on the actual functioning of that act, and making the necessary adaptations of the provisions to reflect the nature of the process created by the Senate Consultations Bill. Madam Chair, thank you very much for the time and for the opportunity to appear before the committee. We will be pleased to take questions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. McDougall. We'll begin with our first round of questions, 7 minutes. John? Mr. Maloney?
I'm sorry, I came in mid-presentation, so I just have some questions that sort of jot to mind. As I understand your presentation, that a panel will be elected, and the Prime Minister will then make choices or a choice from that panel. So, in fact, that the individual who polled the highest number of votes may not be given the nod, and an individual who polled the lowest number of votes could in fact be given the nod to assume be appointed to the Senate. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The way the process works, first off, it depends how many places are being consulted upon for a particular province. It may be the case that there's only one, in which case obviously it becomes somewhat irrelevant as to, because there's only one name that will appear on the list provided by the Chief Electoral Officer. But should there be more than one, in effect what happens is that everybody on that list, whose name appears on that list, their name appears on that list because they have exactly the same number of votes. It may be that at different points in the process that they attain those votes. It could be on the first counting of the votes or the subsequent counting of the votes. But but everybody on there obtains exactly the same number of votes because of the way the single transferable vote system works. Whereas a quota of votes is determined as to how many votes are required in order to be successful. Once you reach that number of votes, that's the number of votes that will appear on that. If you have more, then the excess votes, surplus votes, will be transferred to other candidates according to the other preferences that will be expressed by voters on the ballots. So in effect, everybody ends up with the same quantity of votes. After that, once the list is developed, then there's no obligation on the Prime Minister to make recommendations to the Governor General for appointment based on the order of the list. The flexibility is provided to the Prime Minister to choose whomever he wishes from that list and make that recommendation.
So in effect, the system is not much different from what we have today, except the choice that the Prime Minister can make is certainly a reduced panel. If we talk about an elected Senate, it's not the election in the way that we certainly do the House of Commons. It's being elected to a panel, and the Prime Minister then can willy-nilly pick who he wishes and would not necessarily reflect the wishes of those individuals who have voted in the Senate election, correct?
That it's not an election process. That's correct in the way we would normally conceive of it. It is really a consultation process. The idea is that the people who are selected from this will have a democratic mandate, but it is not. It's not an election process. And in fact, the bill is constructed to make sure that the actual selection process, the criteria for selection, remain as they are now, because to change otherwise to a fully elected process would require a complex constitutional amendment, which this bill doesn't do.
Well, if we're talking about democratic reform, would the latter not be more preferable, even though it's very complex, whatever? If we're talking about real reform in a democratic way, should we not be looking for a truly elected Senate?
As I understand it, I believe it's the position of the government that they do favor an elected Senate. It's, I believe, been articulated in their platform and have stated so publicly as a policy intention. However, given the difficulty in achieving an elected Senate, which has its own complications because of the nature of the amending formula, this is an alternative that provides for a democratic process so that Canadians can be involved in the selection process.
So referring to it as elected Senate is a misnomer. How would you, what label would you give this type of system? What would you call it?
Well, it seems to me that the title of the bill is actually the appropriate way to refer to it. It's a senatorial selection process, consultation process. It's either one. I would think. The formal title is an act to provide for consultations with electors on their preferences for appointments to the Senate. That's about as descriptive as we were able to come up with in terms of what the bill is actually attempting to achieve.
I want to come back to single transferable vote, but I just want a quick little shorty. We've reduced the age requirement from 35 to 30. Any reason for that?
No, I don't believe we've reduced. I think the age requirement to be a senator is 30, and,
is it 30?
And that's what's maintained here as well.
Okay. Again, perhaps I'm a little obtuse. Could you try to explain the single transferable vote system to all of us again? It seems a little.
This one may take a little while, so with your indulgence, I'll.
Madam Chair.
I think we all benefit from the explanation.
The single transferable vote system is a system that is designed to reflect as closely as possible the preferences of voters. It works in single ridings where you only have one person, in which case it transforms itself into something else called an alternative vote system. But it works there as well. But its real utility tends to be more we have multiple persons to be selected from a voting process. It doesn't have to be an electoral process. It could be any process that's designed to select anything. But that's the intent, is to give effect to people's desires. In terms of how it works, it's actually fairly simple for the voter, and I would suggest almost intuitively simple. What it does is people go into a voting process and express their preferences, 1, 2, 3, etc., in terms of who they would like to see be selected from that process. And that's as complicated as it has to get for the individual. Where it gets somewhat complicated is for the administrators, in that they have to understand how the system works and how there's a mathematical process that's associated with it. The first thing that's done in terms of administrating and counting the votes is that you have to determine what is the number of votes that's required for a person to be successful. For members of Parliament and most other elections here in Canada now, I think the first past the post system, that's fairly easy. It's 50% plus 1. When you have more than one member, obviously that number changes. If you have 3 places, then you need to get a third of the votes. If you have 4 places, then you need to get a quarter of the votes, etc. So there's a formula that determines the quota of votes that's necessary to be successful. And all the quota is trying to do is make sure that when the votes are counted, should you arrive at a situation that, let's say, everybody splits their vote equally among all candidates, and you've got 3 places to be elected, the quota is just designed to ensure that you have 3 people only who can be successful, not 4. So just like 50% plus 1 means that one person gets 51, the other gets 49. There's only one person that can be elected. The quota is designed to ensure that if you have 4 places, only 4 people can get that number, not 5. If there's 3 places, only 3 people can get that number. So it's just a simple mathematical formula. It's to determine how many votes you need so that you're sharing the votes equally. So once the quota is determined, then you start to look at the ballots and the preferences that have been expressed by the voters on those ballots. And as I mentioned, the voter goes in and ranks the candidates on the voting list, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., according to however many preferences they wish to express. And this bill has been designed to try and give as much as possible the flexibility to the voter to decide how they want to follow that procedure. So if they only know one candidate and they only want to vote for the one candidate, the bill allows that they can just mark a 1 and they've still got a perfectly valid ballot. If they know 2 candidates and they want to express their preferences about 1 and 2, that's fine as well. Or if there are 17 candidates and they want to go 1 through 17, they can do that as well. So the intention of the bill is to give the maximum flexibility to the voter to express their preferences as they wish. So we've now determined the quota, how many votes are required for someone to be successful. The next step in the process is to look at the ballots and in the first step count up how many first preferences have voters expressed for all of the candidates. So you look at the numbers 1 on the ballots and count up those. And the number, if I'm a candidate and if the quota is determined to be 50, and I have 50 plus first preference votes, then my name goes on the list automatically. And if, for example, there were three Senate places being considered for a province, and they count up all the first place preferences, and 3 people have more than 50 votes, then all 3 will go on the list, and that would be the end of it. Now, it gets a little more complicated when you count up the first preferences, and nobody makes the list, or 1 person makes the list, and you still have 2 more. So then what happens is that the first step is you take the successful person, and if they've got more votes than were necessary to be selected, you take the surplus votes that they have and you transfer those votes to other candidates who have not yet been successful. So you look at the second preferences on those ballots, and those votes, as expressed by the voter, are then transferred over to other candidates. And then you look again to see, once that is done, whether those people have attained the quota, and if so, you stop. And if not, you continue the process. And the process just continues on and on. if at any point after the transfer of surplus votes, so I'm as a candidate, I got more than I needed, and I've transferred those out to other candidates. If nobody has still attained a quota and you still have places to fill, then you go to the other end and you start dropping off candidates who got the least number of votes. So you go to the end of the list, and the person who got the least number of votes is eliminated from the counting process. And those votes, you look at their ballots then, and you look at who was the second preference or the next available preference on those ballots, and then you transfer those votes to the candidates that were expressed by the voters as number 2. Well, in this case, it'd be number 2, but if it were later on in the process, it's the way the bill, what the words in the bill are, the next available candidate. So it depends where you are in the process. But.
I see that your explanation is provoking many more questions. Monsieur Paquette.
I think that for everyone's benefit, it might be good for all of us if you could send us a written example. As you were explaining the system, in my head I was thinking of 5 seats in Quebec, and so 2 million people have the right to vote, and then we have to add another candidate, so we have 6 instead of 5. Math isn't my forte. Why isn't it 400,000 instead of 334,000? So I think it would be good for us to have something on paper, and then we could perhaps better understand the surplus votes. And I know that this system exists elsewhere. What if the quota is not reached? 5 positions in Quebec, 2 million voters, a certain number of candidates, but no one gets 330,334 votes. What happens then? Is the Senate abolished? Well, it's hard for that to happen because the process is designed in a way, or rather the quota is determined by the number of votes, of ballots. So that's the first stage of the process. And it's clear that the candidates will get those votes. Well, there are positions for senators. There are 104 candidates for the 5 positions in Quebec, 2 million voters, and unless you have a celebrity running, I'm sure that a lot of people will not vote, and very few candidates will get more than those 333,000 votes. What happens in that case? Say that all of these candidates receive 200,000 votes or fewer. Well, in that case, it's the number of votes which determines how the process unfolds. In that case, the quota would not be applicable anymore. It would be the person with the highest number of votes who would be the first choice. Second highest number would be the second candidate, but perhaps there might be a transfer. Well, the quota would fall in that case. I would also appreciate if you could give us a concrete example, for instance, and I'm sure that the Privy Council can send us a simulation on paper, if you will. I have another question. As far as advertising is concerned, if a party decides to support candidates, let's dream about a senator running for the Bloc, and the Bloc decides to support such a candidate. How would the support be translated into reality? Could monies be transferred? No, I'm sure that the Bloc will not support any candidates, but say Conservatives or Liberals or the NDP decide to support a candidate. How would this support be exercised? Well, first of all, there are limits on candidates running under a party banner. There are other restrictions as far as financial support is concerned. It would be against the law for parties to transfer money to a candidate. You mentioned advertising. Well, as far as that is concerned, a party would have to be registered as a third party in order to do advertising. Would it be the same rules as those which apply to third parties under the Elections Act? Yes. And we would have to, if you will, neutralize the power political parties have. So a lot of restrictions would be imposed on political parties in terms of their support for any candidates for the Senate. And this is because we must ensure that there is a balance between the electoral process for candidates running for the House and those running for the Senate. So are there expense limits or ceilings? Yes, for the House of Commons. For the Senate? No. Well, why aren't there any spending caps for the Senate candidates? Well, there are several reasons for this. There are several reasons why there are no spending caps for Senate candidates. First of all, it's a provincial process. It's you'd be advertising, you'd be running in the province as a whole and not just for a riding, as is the case in the House of Commons. There are several other restrictions with regard to contributions to a candidate's campaign. The same as are found in the Elections Act. Since contributions to candidates are limited, they will not be able to spend in some cases which would imperil the democratic process. Certainly, there are limits, there are spending caps. And the selection process itself takes place on a provincial level. And the consultations for the Senate and elections take place at the same time. I have a last final question. Again, my example of 5 Senate places in Quebec. In fact, I believe we have 22 in the Senate. The day after the election, one senator retires, another one steps down. Will those positions remain vacant until the next election? Well, it depends on the circumstances of the selection process and the consultation order, or rather the order in which the names appear on the paper. As I said before, it is the Prime Minister's prerogative to decide how many places are available for candidates. So you would create a bank, if you will, or a pool of names. Yes. So if 5 places are to be filled, the Prime Minister might call for 8 candidates or 8 places. Is this included in the bill? Yes.
Well, I must admit I'm really trying to picture the animal we're creating here with the Chihuahua's legs and the cat's tail, and we got a donkey's head, and I'm not quite sure where we're going to put the budgie's beak, so I'll have to ask a few questions to see if this actually looks as ugly as I see it. So these elections happen when the Prime Minister calls them. Do they have, like, at what point do we decide that there's an opening and we need an election?
The general process that's articulated in the bill is that the process will normally be held in conjunction with a federal general election. The bill also provides that the process could be run in conjunction with a provincial general election, but in those circumstances, it would have to be published in the Canada Gazette at a minimum of 6 months in advance that the process would be run in conjunction with a provincial general election. But normally it would be with a federal general election.
So we're talking about places being open. Is that because we know 4 senators in Saskatchewan are going to retire, that they've left, and then we're going to get their names? What if some of them who've said they're going to leave decide they like taking a paycheck and having a 40% absentee rate? They might just continue with that process. At what point do these officially become places that are now open?
Officially, they become places that are open when a senator resigns, for example, or when they attain the age of 75, or when they leave for any other reason. Some people die before the age of 75. But what's provided for in the bill is that the Prime Minister, obviously for the ones that are attaining the age of 75, it's possible to look forward and anticipate what would happen there.
So Senator Joe Blow retires in Ontario. Is that an Ontario-wide selection?
All of the selection process for any of the provinces is province-wide.
Province-wide, okay. I represent a riding the size of Great Britain, and there are very clear restrictions on how much money I can spend to get into various parts of my communities, many of which I need special flights to get into. So we have one election for a spot in Ontario. Did you say that there is no spending limits on how much someone can spend to get their name known in every little town in Ontario and on radio and in newspapers to get ahead of anybody else who's on very limited budget?
There are no spending limits in terms of the expenditures, but there are limits in terms of the contributions. So, for example, if you are a candidate, you cannot spend more than $1,000, the normal contribution limit, plus, as is the case for members of Parliament, there's a doubling up provision, so that as a candidate you can spend an extra $1,000 on your own.
But you can receive as much money as you want?
But you can receive as much money as you want, as long as the person's giving you that money, the limit is only applicable to each individual can only give you $1,000, well, indexed $1,000. So it's $1,100 now, as in the Canada Elections Act. The reason for which there's no...
And I'm sorry to interrupt the testimony.
I hope that's not coming off my time.
No, I'll make sure I give you the...
But this chart is to hopefully help you here, because I think Mr. McDougall was misspeaking there, because he was saying you can only spend $1,000. There's no spending limit, correct? There's contribution limits. You can't give more than $1,000 to a candidate if you're contributing.
Spending limits.
But there's no spending limit as far as the senatorial candidates.
Okay.
Just wanted to clear up any confusion.
It's quite clear.
Yeah, I thought that's...
I'm allowing latitude because I know we're all after correct information.
You have to be
Mr.
35.
Angus.
You can spend as much money as you want, and then when you get there, is it 30 or 35? Okay, so you have to be 30. You can spend as much money as you want, and then when you get there, you're not even guaranteed that your Democratic votes even count because it's still an appointment. I mean, if we're talking about democratic reform, doesn't the word democratic come first? It seems to me that we're putting a lot of window dressing because what you said earlier is that there's, quote, difficulty in achieving an elected Senate. So are we just walking our public around in a whole bunch of circles to take them nowhere because you really can't come back to us and tell us that we can get an elected Senate because the senators, number one, will just say no, we're not going along with it, and that you're going to have to go back to the provinces, and the provinces are going to say no, and so we're back to the situation where nothing's really going to change. Is that why we're not dealing with the issue of an elected Senate and going down this route?
I think perhaps a bit of clarification on the spending point might be useful for members. The spending limit was something that was looked at in constructing the bill. The reason there's no spending limit is on a province-wide election. For example, if you take your case of Ontario as an example, there's roughly a population of voters in Ontario of 12 million or so. If you apply the spending limits that are currently in place for an MP, it works out to be roughly 80 cents per voter. So if you take 80 cents per voter and multiply that by a province-wide population of 12 million, you've got a spending limit of roughly $9 or $10 million. And if you compare that to the restrictions on contributions and the fact that I, as a candidate, can only contribute $2,100 to my own campaign, there's no corporate donations, there's no third-party donations, there's no union donations. The possibility of raising $9 million as an individual candidate becomes rather difficult, it would seem to me at least.
But raising 800,000 and someone else manages only to raise 80,000 because they're up in Red Lake, Ontario, certainly makes a huge difference, right?
Indeed, but if we're talking about spending limits, one needs to consider how the spending limits. It would hard to be, at least from my perspective, it seems difficult to contemplate that you would put a more restrictive spending limit for a province-wide campaign than you would for the campaign of an MP in a much smaller geographical area.
Okay, here's just a final question for you. So 3 people run in an election in Newfoundland or Ontario, well, run in whatever this is, and one person wins. They obviously come up with the most votes, but the Prime Minister doesn't appoint them. The Prime Minister picks the one he likes, which is our tradition right now. And then 8 months go by and another senator kicks the bucket. So does the people on the list still, do we pick from them or do we do the election again? Like, is there a stale date on these people sitting who actually run?
There is no stale date on the list, no.
So someone who ran, like Senator Brown 3 years ago, can get appointed now?
That's correct.
Okay. I'm done.
Mr. Angus? Thank you. Mr. Reid?
Thank you to our witnesses, all 3 of you, for coming here. I had some questions about the single transferable vote system, but before I do that, I just wanted to inquire. Mr. Angus suggested one candidate might raise $800,000. As a practical matter, that strikes me. I guess this is more in the way of a comment than a question. But as a practical matter, we can all, as MPs, raise money for our riding associations from anywhere in the country, and I'm unaware of anybody who has raised anywhere near $800,000 for their local campaign, and of course that information is all publicly available. So I think that a little perspective is required. The impositions we've put, particularly with the elimination of corporate fundraising, make it unlikely that anyone could simply buy their way to office, I guess through running massive advertising campaigns funded by massive spending as a practical matter. But I wanted to ask about the voting system. The single transferable vote system, just you didn't say this, but I gather this is the same system in rough terms that was voted on in British Columbia in the referendum a few years back?
It's very similar to the system that was proposed in BC, yes.
Okay. I used to live in Australia, and so some of the things you're mentioning had some familiarity to me. The alternative vote system, you said, in a place where there's only essentially one vacancy being contested, and of course what I thought of was one of the territories. You said an alternative vote would occur, and that's a term we used in Australia to refer to how they elected their lower house. But that essentially is how similar to the way in which I guess it's a preferential vote, but with only one winner. Is that essentially right?
Essentially that, yes. It follows the same rules, so the process that's set out in the bill for the rules that are followed in the process is the same. In practical terms, going back to your previous comment, that the practicality of contribution limits and what it means, here the practicality of the way the system works means that it becomes an alternative vote system. What happens, obviously, when there's only one candidate,
only one vacancy, not one candidate. I assume you'd have candidates from various
indeed,
parties.
sorry, one vacancy.
Yeah.
There's no transfer of surplus,
Right.
because obviously once someone attains the quota, they become the person who is the candidate, the successful candidate. And what happens when there's only one candidate? Obviously, when you determine the quota, the formula means that the quota becomes as the quota is for first past the post system. It's 50 plus 1.
Right.
So if you get half the votes, you win.
Right.
So what happens as you go through the rules and apply them in the process, it's the people that drop off at the bottom, as I was mentioning earlier, the people with the fewest number of votes, you keep dropping them off and transferring their votes until the person attains a majority. So it's still a majority. It's not only a preferential system, but it's a majoritarian system in that instance.
Okay, and then I guess the other thing is I realize this doesn't apply to a large province like Ontario, but to a small place like Nunavut, effectively the fund, the way in which you collect funds is virtually identical to what it would be in just a regular by-election, effectively in a. Okay.
Essentially, yes.
The other thing I wanted to ask about is, having watched the system operate in Australia, where they have a single transferable vote system for their Senate, is that it's produced a highly partisan upper chamber, but that hasn't been the case in some of the Australian states, which also use single transferable vote. And what seems to drive it in the upper house in Australia to be highly partisan is that effectively most people simply tick off for one of the parties. There's a requirement that you have to vote for every single candidate, rank them in order, or else your ballot is declared invalid. Or you have the option of simply saying, I vote for the Labour Party list, the National Party list, and so on. Is there any, and they call that above-the-line voting, is anything like that contemplated here?
Maybe before I answer that directly, I would say that we looked closely at the Australian situation when we were designing this bill, because we thought it was very instructive of the way that a system could work. They are in the Westminster system. The tradition is very similar to ours. So their legislation has worked very effectively over a number of years. They've had it for a very long time in Australia. So we looked closely at their rules, and to the extent that we could, we actually followed them as a model. We did differ in a number of instances here, though, in this bill, and precisely in the ways that you're suggesting, that the emphasis in Australia is very strongly oriented towards the party. And as you mentioned, that there's an option on the ballot in Australia. Instead of making your selections of 1, 2, 3, or however many candidates you want to do, you can simply tick off a box that says, I vote for this party. And then the party determines the order of the candidates that they would like to see. There was a conscious policy decision taken by the government here that wouldn't be the case here, again, in keeping with the desire to try and diminish the influence of parties in the process and make sure that the Senate retained a degree of independence from what's happening on the Commons side and on the lower house side. So this bill does not contain provisions comparable to those that are found in the Australian model.
Right. Some of the state models in Australia, because STV is widely used in various states. I'm thinking here particularly of the Tasmanian model, which is really the most was seen as the precursor for others who are trying to break away from this party-centric model. Includes things like randomization of the placement of candidates on the ballot to ensure that the parties can't essentially direct first preferences to their preferred candidates, those who've been the best at winning the favor of the party bosses, and so on. I've forgotten the name of that particular process, but it's a a process of ensuring that that doesn't occur. They also allow you to mark down fewer vacancies. If there's, say, 5 vacancies and you only mark down 4, or if there's 20 candidates in the ballot and you only mark down your top 3, your ballot still counts. What about those provisions in this law?
The Australians use what's called a Robson rotation. That's what you're referring to in their selection in the way in the way that the candidates' places names appear on the ballot. We use a similar provision, but it's slightly different in terms of its construction. The provision that's suggested in the bill here is that the candidates' names do indeed be rotated. And the reason for that is that there's studies that have been conducted that show that the order of a person's name on the ballot can have a significant effect in terms of voter reaction to that name. And that having your name, if you're fortunate enough to have a name beginning with the letter A and you're at the top of the ballot because they're alphabetical, there's a demonstrated effect of about 3 to 5% benefit associated with that. So what's provided in the bill is that there be a rotation of names on the ballot here as well, in order to try and diminish the effect of that and across a province for all of the ballots on that, so that each candidate's name should come up to the top on approximately the same number of times over the course of the ballots as they're distributed across the province.
One last question relates to independent candidates. Can independents contest Senate elections?
Yes, independents can contest an election here.
Okay, thank you.
Or a selection process.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. We'll begin our 5-minute round. Madam Folka.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Monsieur McDougall, je voudrais revenir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. McDougall, I'd like to come back to the start of the presentation, or rather of the questions when you described the system to my colleague. There's one thing I don't understand. It's the transfer of votes. Once the quota has been determined, it's the transfer of votes. The surplus votes are transferred to the second place person and then to the third person and so on down the list. Is that correct? And then you start again, beginning with the last name. Here's a scenario. I'm a Senate candidate. I'm from Quebec. Quebec is a big province. It would cost me a lot of money to visit every community in Quebec, especially in the northern part of the province. So I say to myself, why should I travel through Quebec to meet as many people as I can, to get as many votes as I can, when in fact the quota is 555 votes, for instance? In that case, all I have to do really as a candidate is to target 500 or 600 people or voters. I don't have to travel north. I could stay in Laval des Îles, stay close to home, and I'll get my 700 votes. So this is my question to you. What is the reasoning of transferring votes from the first to the second, from the second to the third name? What's the reasoning there? And doesn't that, in fact, make the process less democratic? Well, I'd begin by saying that this is a democratic system, and it's applied in many other systems. Yeah, but that doesn't explain. Someone sat down at 2 a.m., they said, Eureka! I know, we'll transfer votes from number 1 to number 2. What's the reasoning there? The reason why there is a transfer of votes, it's in consideration of the quota. We have to determine first what the quota is. And it's not necessary to obtain more than the quota. If none of the candidates hits the quota, the idea
à utiliser. Merci. To try and avoid wasted votes. And there's a lot of complaints of the system in first past the post that our system doesn't function well because there's a lot of wasted votes.
But I understand this, and I understand the first past the post and all the weaknesses. That's fine. And I'm not trying to argue against this new system. I'm trying to understand the logic behind it. Because if we're talking about wasted votes, then I could say, well, if I vote for number 1 and I was one of the excedents, then my vote went to number 2. I didn't want my vote to go to number 2. I wanted to stay with number 1.
But if you don't want to, if you just want to vote for number 1 and nobody else, you can certainly do that.
But you still haven't
So you just mark the
explained.
1.
I understand that.
But
you still haven't explained the rationale behind the fact that you wanted to be transferring the votes from 1 to 2, from 2 to 3, and so on. That's the point, really, that I'm trying to make.
The rationale is that, okay, so if you're a voter and you vote for number 1, number 2, number 3, obviously that indicates that you have preferences other than number 1 in the first instance. Is there someone else that you'd like to see selected? You'd like to see this person selected first, this one selected second, this one selected third, etc. You determine the quota, so your first person got to number 1 and has surplus votes. So the idea is then to look at those ballots and that are surplus to that and say, well, what were the second preferences for those persons, and transfer those votes out so those votes are no longer wasted. In a first past the post system, those votes, once you get over the 50% threshold, whether you get 51 or 87% or 98%, anything above 50% doesn't count anymore.
But are you excuse me, I think I finally got a hold of it. Are you then counting for number 2 how many votes he got as number 1, or how many votes he got for number 2?
Maybe I can explain. There's 3 ways that you could do this for the ones with the surplus number of votes. You could just look at those surplus and say what are the numbers on those for number 2 would be the next instance. So of those surplus, who's number 2, and we'll give the votes there. That would be one way. A second way would be you could do a random selection. The problem with doing it that way is that you don't know that the number 2 preferences on the 52nd ballot that is over the surplus is the same as the first person. Maybe the first person that contributed to your surplus had very different ideas as to who should be number 2. So what the process is provided for in the bill here is that you look at all of the ballots, every one of them, and you look at, for that candidate that's received more than a surplus, you look at each ballot and you look for what was the second preference for all of those persons. So every ballot is at play. And then what you need to do is you need to determine, well, what's the value of those? So the process here is that you calculate what's called a transfer value. And the transfer value is simply the value, you essentially take the portion of the vote. So if you consider the vote to be 1, the whole number 1, what portion of that vote, of the first preference, would have been necessary in order to just achieve the quota and nothing more? So if for example, I only needed 75% of every person's vote in here in order to reach the quota, that means that 25% of everybody's vote in here can be used for the second preference that everybody in here expressed.
And all this... Okay, thank you.
Your time's expired. Mr. Lukowski.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. McDougall. I have to admit that while I'm very, very familiar with the concept of preferential balloting, I'm a little confused on the STV. In one of my former lives, for several years, for nomination meetings in Saskatchewan, we used the concept of preferential balloting, and that's, of course, when you only select, at the end of the day, one candidate. And it's fairly simple, although the administrators, the people counting the ballot, have to do it manually, and it takes some time if you've got many candidates running. So I would agree with Mr. Maloney's suggestion that, perhaps there'd be some further explanation, either written or otherwise, and it may be worthwhile actually to, sort of show something out in a demonstration how this thing works, because it does get a little confusing. The one point I would make, and this we found out in Saskatchewan when we set up our own preferential balloting system, we examined the process in Australia and New Zealand and did a lot of kind of field testing. And what we found, rather than, I think you had mentioned, Mr. McDougall, that the proposal on the ballots that would be coming forward, the voters would mark their preference if there was multi-candidates by saying 1, 2, 3, or 4, indicating their first choice, their second preference, their third preference, and their fourth. What we found is that the voters are far more used to marking X's rather than 1, 2, 3, or 4. So what we did on our ballots, we would have, if you can kind of imagine this, the names of the voters would be down vertically down the left-hand side, and horizontally across the top of the ballot would be first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice, and people would just mark an X corresponding with the name and the choice they wanted. So they didn't mark 1, 2, 3, or 4. We found that avoided a whole bunch of confusion, and I think that if this is introduced in the form that you're suggesting, there'd have to be a whole bunch of education to the voters on how to cast their ballots. So I would just put that out as a suggestion. You may want to take a look at designing a system so people can actually mark their preference with an X rather than a number. That might prove to be a little more, well, might be a little easier. The second couple comments, just based on some conversation and questions around the table. There's a question saying, well, if there's not really an elected Senate and the Prime Minister still has the ability to appoint whoever he wishes, you know, where's the democracy in that? Well, I think the reason is because of the constitutional challenges that could occur. Right now, to have an elected Senate, you'd have to change the Constitution. That's my understanding, and I know we're going to have constitutional experts coming in later as witnesses. So my understanding is, since we probably, and I think Mr. Angus is quite correct, there's no way that the provinces would agree. I mean, you wouldn't get 7 provinces and 50% of the population agreeing to an elected Senate. So this would still be the next best thing. It would allow the voters in each province to express their preference as to who they would like to see as their senator or senators without having them elected. The Prime Minister then would appoint them, as is the current process, but probably based on the votes that each of the candidates received. And I would suggest the kind of the fail-safe is that I think any Prime Minister would be appointing other than, you know, put it this way, if a Prime Minister wanted to appoint someone other than the person who received the most amount of votes in the consultation process, he would be doing so at his political peril. Because if you wanted to do that, if you wanted to appoint whoever you wished, why go through this whole process of having consultations? Just stick with the system we've got and just appoint people you wish. But I think what we're trying to do here, what the minister's trying to do, is to at least allow the people of each province a chance to express their preference. And then I think it would be natural to assume that the Prime Minister then, regardless of who that person is who received the most votes, would normally say, well, I'm appointing that person because the province has expressed their opinion through a consultation process. So I think that's the fail-safe system, I believe. And I would just like your comments on that. If in the design of this system, if it was the bill was put together to allow constitutional, challenges, because I can see that if you had straight elections, we'd be in a morass constitutionally, and this is the next best, I guess, system to avoid getting into a whole constitutional crisis. Would that be an accurate statement that this is something that will not, in your opinion at least, will not result in any constitutional problems and still allow the voters to express their preference?
That would certainly be our opinion here. We were, I guess, to begin, we were very conscious of the way the Constitution is constructed and what is necessary if one wishes to change the method of selection. That requires an amendment to the Constitution, as you mentioned, with 7 provinces representing 50% of the population agreeing to that. And as we have seen in the past, multilateral, complex, comprehensive constitutional change with respect to the Senate has been impossible to achieve. And indeed, the Confederation of the Provinces studied this for several years and were unable to come to any conclusion themselves as to how they would proceed with Senate reform. So as you suggest, I think from a democratic reform perspective, this would be the next best thing, where you're working within the existing system with the powers that are currently provided to the Governor General to appoint senators, and to the prerogative of the Prime Minister to make recommendations to the Governor General. So this bill certainly respects those parameters and was designed with that in mind. There's a number of ways, as I mentioned earlier, some of the flexibility that we've designed into this process indeed is designed to reflect those constraints as well, if you will. That the Prime Minister decides whether to invoke the process in the first instance. There's no obligation on the Prime Minister to have a consultation. The Prime Minister decides for how many provinces a consultation will be held. The Prime Minister decides whether it will be with a federal general election or in conjunction with a provincial general election. There's no obligation on the Prime Minister to force the Prime Minister to make a recommendation to the Governor General. It's still, that flexibility is left with respect to the Prime Minister to do that. So all of those design parameters are to reflect the constraints that we have in the Constitution. So yes, very much so. Just if I may, a comment on your earlier point as well in terms of the simplicity of design. The complexities, I think, as I mentioned earlier, are really for the administrators. It's really for the voters. I think everywhere where the STV system has been deployed, Australia, in the United Kingdom, in many of the emerging democracies, or some of the emerging democracies as well in the former Soviet Union, there's been no instance of the voters having difficulty following the system. Now, I think it is important that the voters have confidence that the process is well designed and properly administered. And I think we have some strong degree of favor here that Canada has a very well-regarded electoral system and electoral process with Elections Canada. So I think we're a leg up on many other jurisdictions, if you will. And yes, voter education I think will be particularly important on this. And everywhere where the system has been deployed for the first time, the focus of voter education has indeed been on the simplicity of the system from a voter perspective rather than from an administrator's perspective.
Thank you, Mr. McDougall. Madame Picard, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 2 points, Mr. McDougall. Section 54 of the bill. It says, and the interpreter is still looking for the section, subject to Section 55, where at any count no nominee attains a number of votes at least equal to the quota, and so on and so forth. In answer to previous questions, I have the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, that what you are saying is that you transfer to the second and then to the third and to the fourth candidates, where here it says the nominee having obtained the smallest number of votes shall be eliminated from subsequent counts. That's right, if quotas are not met. Well, there are 2 transfer possibilities. One, a situation in which there is a surplus of votes. So if you have a candidate who exceeds the quota, when that happens, we go down the ballot to determine who is the second choice. But there's another situation in which none of the candidates meet the quota. So that's another circumstance. And when that happens, the person who had the least number of votes will be dropped from the list. Under that process, each candidate's votes will be tallied and the votes will be transferred. You said that you might explain the transitory system. This transitional system will be the same one as the one that's used in the House of Commons. There will be a 2-year period in which the Chief Electoral Officer will have time to implement the single transferable vote system. So the first time the vote is held, if the STV vote is not in place, we will use the same voting system as used for the House of Commons. Is that what you were referring to? Yes. Well, it would be good to have a concrete example. 5 vacancies in Quebec, 10 candidates. Do we take the 5 first ones? It will be the 5 candidates with a majority of votes. The 5 with the highest percentages of votes will be elected. It's less specific, but there will be a place where voters can mark the ballots with an X, and there will be an order, 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, it would be interesting to receive a concrete example to illustrate what's just been explained, because it's not clear in my head.
Vous avez fini? Vous avez terminé?
Are you done? Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. I got to tell you, the most interesting thing I heard so far is the placement on the ballot. I guess I want to run against someone like a Z rather than someone whose name starts with A. Is that what I'm to understand?
No, what's on the that would be the case if there weren't provisions for rotation of the ballot.
Okay,
but the bill
I'm just thinking of individuals I've run against in the past. Paul said that explains some things. I would like to get your comments. A lot of the questions that I heard in the first round about why don't we just do this and why don't we just do that. Everything that we're dealing with and everything that you've been tasked in drafting this piece of legislation has to be seen through the filter, the context of constitutional constraints that we have. And I'm wondering, you did touch on this a bit in response to Mr. Lewiski, but I'm wondering if you can, if possible, item by item, or hit the high spots on where flexibilities had to be left in place, where, in the case of the Prime Minister and with the Governor General, where necessary discretion has to be left without getting into constitutional amendments. So, in light of our current constraints, how this bill reacts to that, how this bill has to be shaped in a way that we have some genuine consultation, we have some genuine democratic input, but while respecting the limits that we're currently faced with.
In the first instance, I guess the Constitution of Canada currently provides for the process for selecting senators, and it's when I say process, it's not much of a process. I guess it's just that the Governor General summons persons to the Senate, and it's by constitutional convention that advice of the Governor General is or the process of the Governor General doing so is on the advice of the Prime Minister. The Constitution also provides that if you were to change the process of selection of senators, and so as I just said, set out in the Constitution, that would require what's called a complex constitutional amendment, so with the engagement of the provinces. As I think we've indicated, there's little prospect of that happening in the short term. So the next best approach from a democratic reform perspective is to obtain as strongly as possible, or ascertain as strongly as possible, the wishes of Canadians directly as to who they would like to have represent them in the Senate, recognizing that Senate appointments currently, except for Quebec, are province-wide. And of course, in the case of Quebec, there's provisions in the Constitution that senators are appointed for electoral districts, 24 electoral districts in Quebec. So those are the general parameters surrounding the Constitution and what's required currently within that. So this bill is certainly designed with those in mind. And as you mentioned, the bill is crafted so as to ensure that we don't trip over those provisions and provide for a process that's not respecting those. So the bill provides a number of areas of flexibility for the Prime Minister in terms of when to use the consultation instrument, how to use it. It's the Prime Minister that's deciding the type of advice he would like to get from the Canadian public, and it is advice to him, and then for him to make his decision in terms of recommendations to the Governor General. So it's a political imperative that's created, as Mr. Lukuski mentioned, rather than a legal imperative. There's no obligation on the Prime Minister to select anybody from the list, but presumably there may be political consequences for a Prime Minister deploying an instrument such as this, and then not relying on the results from it. In that way, it's very similar, perhaps, to another bill that's been passed by Parliament in this session with respect to fixed election dates, where the prerogative of the Prime Minister has some self-imposed constraints put upon it, and that's certainly what's happening here. Again, respecting, as that bill did, the constitutional limitations as to what the Prime Minister acting, or the government acting alone, can do. So, certain.
Imposed. We'll go back to Mr. Angus, please.
Thank you. So I accept the argument. I mean, it's been the New Democratic position that elected Senate is not going to happen simply because there's enough entrenched interest to say it won't happen. So I'm interested in following this little side puppet show we're creating here for consultation process. So given that the Prime Minister can't deal with real democratic reform, and we're going to go down a consultation route, why is the Prime Minister and the government writing into the bill that they don't have to bother to even use this consultation process? Why is it not saying in the bill that if a senator resigns, there will be a Senate election come either first the provincial election if the province is willing, or the federal election? Why is it a matter of choice?
The matter of choice is, again, in relation to the previous question, I guess, that may well be seen as fettering the discretion of the Governor General or the Prime Minister with respect to the appointment process, and require the use of an amendment process to the Constitution itself.
So we can go willy-nilly on a consultation process or not at all, and that won't intervene with anything? Could we not say that, given the constraints of the Constitution Act, that whenever a senator retires, there will be a consultation process with the public, and that consultation process will, the choice of the consultation process will be the person the Prime Minister accepts? You're saying the Prime Minister doesn't have to do a consultation process. He can pick any failed political candidate he wants, he or she, to that position, and this consultation process just sits by the side of the road. It's a matter of choice. Why is that in the bill? Why is it not guaranteed that there will be a consultation?
So that's my colleague to comment on that.
A distinction should be drawn, I think, between legal considerations, or rather constitutional considerations, and political considerations. Some of the matters you outlined could perhaps be speaking to political considerations, but as matters of constitutional compliance, it was thought prudent to ensure that the Prime Minister not be obliged to hold a consultation, nor be obliged to appoint names submitted to him as a result of a consultation. Otherwise, it could be seen as fettering with the prerogative of the Prime Minister to recommend, according to the dispositions or constitutional conventions set out as matters of convention, and the powers for summoning persons to the Senate set out in the Constitution. The bill is currently drafted in such a way as to ensure that the powers of, or the prerogative of the Prime Minister and the powers of the Governor General are not in any way fettered. Matters of political practice may develop, but the bill cannot and does not speak to that.
So choosing not to accept a candidate that was democratically consulted by the people is fine. Choosing not to hold a consultation process at all. You're saying this is so that we don't get into any constitutional problems. Is that it?
Not passing a judgment as to whether or not it's fine.
But it would be guaranteed that your opinion would be that would be the sole, like that was the sole reason that the Prime Minister can invoke or not invoke at will.
That was the primary consideration at play for ensuring constitutional compliance. Yes.
I don't know. I mean, I guess for me, the issue of democratic reform is based on the notion that the democratic vote actually counts. A democratic consultation, I think, went out with King John and Robert Mugabe. I mean, we're telling the Canadian public that they can participate in this consultation process, and the Prime Minister might choose them, but he might not. He might choose somebody else. Do you think there's going to be a lot of public buy-in on this?
I think an analogy could be drawn to the Referendum Act, on which a lot of the structure or thinking behind consultation in this bill is provided for. So a referendum, when held, does not bind any of the powers to which the referendum results
but
are
you can't.
submitted.
But in a referendum, you can't take the second choice. You're going to recognize that there is a public will, right?
As the voting method outlined in this bill provides for the expression of the democratic decisions by voters, the single transferable vote is a democratic process in terms of expressing the preferences of voters, no more or no less than the results of a referendum on a yes or no question.
But this isn't an election. This is a consultation about possible choices to the Prime Minister. Yeah, I just got to ask you a question here because I want to get it clear. So we've got one spot open in Ontario. What's the size of the quota that person needs?
It'll depend on the number of completed ballots. To go back to an earlier question as to whether or not someone could get in with X
so if
number
10% of the people vote, or 50% it won't?
The formula is the total number of ballots divided by the number of vacancies plus 1.
So do you have a sense for Ontario? If there's one position open, what's the difference with a quota for 6 people?
So if
last question.
Yes, I know. I'm just trying to get this.
If there's one position, well, you'd have to assume how many people voted. Let's say there's 10 million people that vote. It would be 5 million plus a couple of voters.
That would be the
that would be the quota. That's the number of votes that you would need in order to.
Thank you. Mr. Hill?
Well, I guess first of all, I'd like to start by stating that I find it unfortunate when we have an issue like this where it would be so easy for us, or should be so easy for us, to be at least respectful, and we have one committee member that decides that he has to use terms like puppet show and stuff like this. I don't know how that feeds into us trying to operate in a respectful manner, and unfortunately it's increasingly how the standing committees operate. I was hopeful that perhaps the legislative committee wouldn't be subjected to that, but apologies to the witnesses. I'd like to pick up though on some of the comments that Mr. Angus was making, because quite frankly, I've been here for almost 15 years. I'm a strong advocate of Senate reform. I've said this before, and I find it extremely disturbing that the fallback position for many of my colleagues from other parties always seems to be that if you can't go all the way towards an elected Senate, in other words, change the Constitution, we know all the hurdles. Many of us have, if not having been here, certainly viewed the country seized with the machinations of Meech Lake and the Charlottetown Accord, and where all that led, frustratingly so, in the end. And so I find it disappointing, I guess, that we can't view this and discuss this and debate this as an improvement, because that's how I see it. It's a step in the right direction. It's not the whole enchilada, so to speak, but at least it would give Canadians some choice. Now, Mr. Angus was saying, how do you know that electors are going to buy into this, and suggesting that perhaps there's no benefit. But from my window, the facts is that I think they will buy in because they're going to be given some choice that they don't have now at all. I mean, the default position is to go back to the system we've got, whereby traditionally a Liberal Prime Minister appoints Liberals to the Senate. A Conservative appoints Conservatives to the Senate. So if that's what we want in this country, is that archaic system, well, that's what we can have. But, I think that Bill C20 is an honest attempt to do what we can respecting the confines of the Constitution, and that's what I hear from the witness as well. I'd also like to point out that, when he says, how do we suggest that the public would buy in, I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it was somewhere around 300,000 or something Albertans that voted in a Senate selection there. Far more than ever voted for any single MP. I think the average riding for a member of Parliament is somewhere around 100,000. We're lucky if we get half of the eligible voters out to vote anymore. And so I think that this does constitute a good step forward, and that it is a step in democratic reform or towards democratic reform, and we should try and discuss that within those confines. So I would just ask, I guess, the witnesses through you, Madam Chairman, to comment perhaps further on this whole notion that somehow the public wouldn't buy in if they're given an opportunity, because I think the experience in Alberta, and I don't think it'd be dramatically different in other provinces, suggests otherwise.
Well, perhaps I can respond on the last point on the public buying in. Certainly, any indications that we have seen in terms of public will on Senate reform, there's a very strong inclination amongst the public that the Senate be reformed in some manner. I think it's fair to say that following some unsuccessful constitutional reforms, the public was weary of reform, that maybe following on that they're now wary of reform, and so that incremental reform does seem to be somewhat appealing to them. The government undertook some national consultations over the past year, one of the topics of which was Senate reform, and there were citizens selected from across each province and the territories to participate in a day-and-a-half-long session on democratic reform. And one of the topics was the Senate, and overwhelmingly in those sessions there was a strong inclination expressed by the participants, who were randomly selected from the public, that the Senate be reformed. But indeed they were wary of complex constitutional reform, fearing that it would end up, as many other attempts at Senate reform have done, going nowhere. And that came out strongly right across the country in every province. Similarly, there was a national poll that was conducted to correspond to that, to try and assess amongst the general public who didn't participate in forums whether their views were different from those who participated. And again, the results were very similar. There was a strong, as I recall, was up in the 60-70% range, 79%, I'm being shown here, of Canadians supporting Senate reform in some manner, and strong support for incremental type reform, getting done whatever could be done.
Thank you for your insights, Mr. McDougall. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're suspending at 5 to deal with committee matters. So we have 2 minutes left. So, quick questions. Madam Fry?
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll be as quick as I can. I think it's kind of sad when we talk about respecting and disrespecting each other, and that anyone who questions or disagrees with a particular point of view is therefore seen as being causing trouble. And I have never seen it that way. I think there's room for disagreement around the table, and at the end of the day we can come up with what we agree on, and it should be done in a respectful manner, but disagreeing in itself is not necessarily disrespectful. I wanted to ask the question because I think the issue of democracy and democratic reform is obviously at the heart of what everyone is trying to talk about. And I think I would suggest to you that when the majority of people said that they wanted to see Senate reform, I think they meant that they wanted to have a say in how senators got to where they were. And I would think most people would believe that this is an extraordinarily expensive way to be able to find out what people think and then to have someone decide that they don't even like their choices. I think that's not democratic. Secondly, it's very undemocratic to suggest that in order to run, you have to find $4 million. You're self-selecting a whole bunch of people who cannot run because they can't ever achieve that kind of money. So I think that while I understand the need for reform, I accept it. I understand that you don't want to go the whole route for constitutional change. I think there is a way of discussing how this can become more democratic, how this may be able to have people believe that if the cost of going out and doing this is to be acceptable, that they would have to know that it wasn't just, thank you very much, but I don't think I like any of the above.
She's going to cut you off.
And I know why they say that you can't do that and nobody would do it, but we have seen instances with this government where they have done things that we believe are undemocratic. So I think for me, there's an issue of trust here, and there's an issue of actually being democratic.
That sounded like a comment.
It was.
So thank you, Madam Pryor. On that note, I'd like to say that there is nothing more illuminating than a technical briefing, so I want to thank you for lighting up our Wednesday here. And I'm sure everybody has many more questions, but you have enhanced our knowledge on the bill. So I'd like to thank you. Mr. Maloney.
I don't want to ask a question.
Yeah.
I just, could we have this panel back again? There are some members of the committee who haven't had an opportunity to ask one question, and I think there are others who would like to ask more, too. Can we continue this briefing at
I think
another
that
meeting?
there'll probably be an opportunity that we can have you back, if you're willing. Mr. Reid?
Yeah. Look, we're about to discuss the glacial pace at which this committee is scheduled to move here. And I can't help observe that Mr. Maloney never went and bothered to ask whether he could split his time with anybody.
Mr. Reid, we're about to go into committee business where we're going to be discussing the schedule. So I'd really just like to thank
We're discussing the schedule publicly right now.
Okay. I'd like to thank our witnesses very much, and we will suspend for 2 minutes. Thank you.